Make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. See that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, for who a single meal sold his inheritance rights to the oldest son. Afterwards, as you know, when he wanted to inherit his blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done. You have not come to a mountain that can be touched and that is burning with fire, to darkness, gloom, and storm, to a trumpet blast, or to such a voice speaking words that those who heard it begged that no further word be spoken to them, because they could not bear what was commanded. If even an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned to death. The sight was so terrifying that Moses said, I am trembling with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time, his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. The words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire.
I am rapidly becoming an armchair expert in running injuries. I should be clear, I'm not an expert in diagnosing them. I'm an expert in getting them. The story of my 20s and my sporting career of my 20s has been a story of non-stop injuries. And so I've been confined to an armchair for most of my 20s. And as such, I'm becoming very accustomed to the various methods and exercises needed to recover. And one of those key implements I've had to buy on Amazon over the years is one of these. This is a peanut, shaped like a peanut. And what you do is very simple, is you put your body weight on it. And it's incredibly painful. I try to avoid using this as far as possible because it is an implement of torture, level with thumb screws and the rack. However, if I want to keep running, I need to be using things like this. I need various things to help me recover from my self-inflicted injuries. The question I'd like us to think about tonight, though, is how do we recover from self-inflicted spiritual injuries? A physical injury is quite straightforward. You can buy various implements of torture. But a spiritual implement, you can't buy. You see, last week, Mr. Hebrews told us to strengthen feeble arms and weak knees, and to make level paths for our feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. And the implication is that the original readers are spiritually injured. And if you've been following our series over the last few months, you'll have seen that this is the book of Hebrews written to a group of Jewish Christians predominantly, who are having a massive nostalgia hit. They were missing the good old days. And they were missing the good old days so much that they were taking their eyes off Jesus. And let's be honest, it's really easily done. It's easy to fix our eyes on things that used to happen, certain songs we used to sing, certain ways of doing midweek gatherings, certain ways of doing evangelism, certain ways of doing discipleship. It's easy to miss the leadership styles of previous pastors. And it's easy to miss various emphases in preaching and teaching in church life. And the Hebrews were missing those things so much that they cut out Jesus. And it had led to a spiritual injury, a self-inflicted spiritual injury. And the billion-dollar question is, what does recovery look like? And that question is not as straightforward as you might think. Because if you were to do a straw poll of Christians around the world, you'd get a range of different answers as to how you recover from a spiritual injury. It's the same in the sporting world. There are all sorts of weird and wonderful theories as to how you recover. But even more so in the Christian world. All over the place, there are Christian books, there are podcasts, there are Instagram accounts, there are YouTube channels. There are all sorts of things about how you can make your own walk with God better. But it's difficult really to know where to begin. And it's difficult to know which things will actually make me better and which things will make me worse. After all, if you follow any sport, you'll know that sometimes athletes are very, very good at making an injury worse. You've all seen the player who's come back onto the football pitch a little bit too soon and has had to go off after a few minutes. What does spiritual recovery actually look like? What does moving forward in Jesus actually look like? And the end of Hebrews 12 and into chapter 13 are an answer to that question. And so this week we're going to look at the first bit of that answer. And as I was studying it, I was really struck how central other Christians are to our recovery. Moving forward in Jesus is a group exercise. It's something we all do together, not as simply as individuals. Spiritual strength and spiritual recovery are connected to community, to the local church. It's very possible, of course, to come to Jesus without a church. I'm sure a number of us in this room became Christians in our bedrooms, in a quiet place on our own. But it's nigh impossible to move forward with Jesus long term if you're disconnected from some sort of church, some sort of community. And in this passage, we're going to see that moving forward in Jesus has 4 components. First, chasing together. Second, seeing together. Third, celebrating together. And fourth, accepting together. First, chasing together. Verse 14 begins, make every effort. The Greek verb here means to chase after, to pursue, like a cat and a mouse. It's a hunting kind of verb. It's like to chase. And so we need to be chasing after something. And Mr. Hebrews is very clear what we need to be chasing after. Firstly, we need to live in peace with everyone. And so spiritual recovery looks like sorting out our arguments and disagreements with one another. You don't have to live with someone for very long to fall out with them. As someone fairly newly married, I can testify to that. But the first thing we need to do is to try and sort out our arguments and disagreements with our Christian brothers and sisters. And this horizontal instruction, if you like, is joined by a vertical one. We need to be holy, because without holiness, no one will see the Lord. We need to be chasing after holiness. Now, Mr. Hebrews here is assuming that if someone is genuinely a Christian, if someone is genuinely born again, if someone has come to know Jesus and is trusting in the blood of Jesus, then they will be chasing after the best possible relationship with Jesus. And that means focusing on killing the remaining sin in their lives. I wonder how that's going. Just this evening, I've been reminded just how much sin is in my own heart. But moving forward in Jesus means chasing together, living in peace with each other, and being holy. Killing the sin that we constantly fight day after day. But spiritual recovery is not simply a matter of chasing together. It's also a matter of seeing together. And you see that in verses 15 to 17. See to it. Now, this is for the kind of the nerds in the room. The Greek verb here is linked to the Greek noun we translate into English as elder. So an elder in the Bible is an overseer. This verb, see to it, is connected. And in the first instance, this following bit applies particularly to the elders in the room. And I can see a few dotted around. But it also applies to all of us to some extent. And so there's a list. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. See to it that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau. Do you remember Esau? He's that tragic Old Testament character you can read about in the book of Genesis. And he embodies almost everything on this list. Despite being in the family line of Abraham and being surrounded by God's people and having all the trappings of a genuine child of Abraham, he was the eldest son. He was due to inherit everything. Esau ultimately fell short of the grace of God. And for a single meal, a bowl of lentil soup, no less, he swapped his inheritance rights as the eldest son. Genesis tells us that Esau was sexually immoral, having 3 wives, and he caused enormous trouble for his family, for Isaac and Rebekah, his parents. He was a bitter root that led hundreds of people away from the living God, defiling many. Esau is the ancient equivalent of an unbelieving church member, a non-Christian who is a regular part of church life. And it's far more common than we think. One of the jobs of a church, particularly the job of an elder, is to watch over fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord. It's not about shaming people into some kind of formal morality. Rather, it's constantly showing people Jesus and then connecting all of life to him. And if Jesus is truly at the center of our churches, at our communities, then the Esau's within it will do either one of 2 things. Either they will come to know Jesus and no longer fall short of the grace of God, or they'll move towards the margins. Because whenever the gospel is preached, those are the 2 movements that people make. We need to be praying that no member of our churches ends up like Esau. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he'd done. It's a tragic story. And it's replicated hundreds upon thousands of times. It's replicated hundreds of thousands of times in this city right now. I'm not going to name any Esau's. I have no idea who the Esau's are in Headley Park Church, let alone Phillip Street. But we need to be praying. We need to be praying that people come to know Jesus. That no one falls short of his grace. We move forward in Jesus by chasing together, by seeing together, and also by celebrating together. Verses 18 to 24. These verses are the reasons why Christians do what they do together. And Mr. Hebrews compares our situation to two scenes in the Bible. And the first is Mount Sinai, where the Old Testament Israelites gathered to hear the law. And you can read about that in the book of Exodus. And the key point he's making by this comparison is, you're not here. You are not at Mount Sinai. And as you read the description, thank goodness. Look down at the text. It looks terrifying, burning with fire and darkness, gloom and storm. It sounds terrifying. There's this enormous trumpet blast. And there's a voice speaking words in such a way that people begged that no further word of that voice be spoken to them. Imagine a voice so scary that you couldn't hear it. That is what the Old Testament Israelites faced. And it actually was terrifying. They could not bear what was commanded. If even an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned to death. And the sight was so terrifying that Moses, even Moses, the man of God, the servant of God, the one who actually ended up climbing up that mountain, said, I am trembling with fear. Thank goodness we have not come to Mount Sinai. It's one of the scenes in the Bible I would never want to see. There are some scenes in the Bible I'd love to see. Sinai is definitely not one of them. You see, Sinai is the place where the otherness, the holiness of God is most felt. At Sinai, sinful humanity can only quake with terror as it fears being found out and zapped. Friends, we don't do what we do for fear of being zapped, for fear of God's wrath. We shouldn't be meeting together out of fear, because our situation is actually more like another scene in the Bible, a far better one. You can see it in verse 22. You have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Zion in the Bible is a place of joy. It's a place of belonging. It's a place of celebration. It's where the intimacy of God was most felt by his people in the Old Testament, because Mount Zion was where the temple was. It was where God met with humanity, albeit with multiple safeguards, but that was where God was closest. And this Mount Zion is even better than that Mount Zion. Do you notice? It's called the heavenly Jerusalem. Mount Zion was the highest point in the earthly Jerusalem. The heavenly Jerusalem, even though it is unseen, is even more real than the one you can fly to, but that's not recommended these days. Heavenly Jerusalem is so much more vibrant than the earthly Jerusalem ever was in 2 Samuel 6, when the Ark of the Covenant arrived. Do you remember the scene? David led the procession up and he danced with joy, so much so that his wife was embarrassed. It was a jubilant scene. Or maybe 1 Kings 8. If you're at Headley Park, you heard me preach on it a couple of weeks ago, so you should be a bit more familiar with it. But in 1 Kings 8, Solomon's temple is finished. And again, there is another party, a celebration, one that puts VE Day into the shade. That level of party, that level of celebration. And the heavenly Jerusalem celebrates even more, because you have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. Friends, when Christians gather together, we are joining hordes upon hordes of angels and all of our brothers and sisters who have ever lived in praising God. Do you remember a couple of weeks ago when Craig gave us the Hall of Fame of all the Old Testament characters? Abraham, Moses, all those names. Do you remember all the New Testament heroes you read about? Paul, Peter, John, Mary Magdalene. Remember all those names in the Bible? Maybe all those names from those history lessons many, many years ago of people who stood and died for the faith. All of those people right now are gathered around that throne worshiping God. In a couple of hours' time, there is going to be an enormous crowd in a stadium in Berlin looking at the Euros finals. And for some bizarre reason, England are in it. That is going to be an enormous crowd. But the crowd we join every single Sunday puts that one in the shade. This gathering looks, no offense, fairly unimpressive compared to that one in Berlin. But in reality, it is so much bigger and better. Can you see that? We've come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. And we don't need to feel like imposters. Why? Because right there is Jesus Christ, the mediator of a new covenant. He's the mediator, the middleman. And the role of Jesus in the Bible is to turn Mount Sinai into Mount Zion. You see, his sprinkled blood speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Do you remember Abel? Another character in the book of Genesis. He was the first murder victim in your Bible. And when he died, his blood cried out to God for vengeance, for wrath. But when Jesus died, his blood cried something really different. It cried, "Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Jesus' blood does not cry out for vengeance. It cries out for forgiveness. And in a few minutes, we're going to share communion together, and we're going to celebrate that forgiveness that Jesus has brought for us. You see, we relate to God not because of anything we do, but because of what he has done. Jesus climbed that terrifying mountain with the dark cloud and has opened a way for us to ascend with shouts of joy and celebration. Without Jesus, there is no joyful Zion. There is only fearful Sinai, as sinners come into contact with a holy God. But with Jesus, there is no more fearful Sinai. There is only joyful Zion. Do you believe this? When we celebrate together, we are celebrating that he is here with us. And he is here in this room right now. Closer than we can possibly imagine. And so our gatherings are celebrations. Moving forward with Jesus is chasing together. It's seeing together. It's celebrating together. Lastly, it's accepting together. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. If they, that's the generation at Mount Sinai, did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we, if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? If we turn away from Jesus now, without ever coming back, we go straight back to Sinai. if we ignore him, if we push him away, we become the Sinai generation. We become another Esau. We will die apart from God and apart from his rest. Do you remember the Sinai generation? None of them made the promised land, not even Moses. Only 2 did, Joshua and Caleb. And that's because they trusted God even when no one else did. Everyone else died without ever seeing Mount Zion. And that could happen to us too if we move away from Jesus, if we don't stick with him. There's a serious warning in the book of Hebrews. When God spoke at Sinai, his voice shook the earth. But now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. Here, Mr. Hebrews is quoting Haggai. And this shaking is the coming of the Lord's glory. Haggai here, broadly speaking, is talking of every time the Lord comes. And there are multiple layers to this. There's the coming of the Lord into the second temple of Haggai's day. There's the coming of the Lord at Christmas, the coming of the Lord at Pentecost. And there's also the final return of Jesus. And I think Mr. Hebrews here is focusing primarily on that final return. The words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken. The final shaking will filter out the fallen, temporary things of this earth that are apart from Jesus. That's what Mr. Hebrews is talking about when he mentions the created things. It's like a baker sort of sieving out their flour. It's like a prospector sifting for gold, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. And then it will be remade into something infinitely more glorious. As that heavenly Mount Zion moves to sight. Friends, those that hear what Jesus says and walk forward with him will not be shaken. They will run the race. They will finish the course. And they will stand on that podium in celebration. Christians are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. We've seen, haven't we, in the last few weeks, the kingdoms of this earth can be shaken. We changed government overnight in this country. And right now, a terrible shaking is going through the United States as a former president got shot at by an assassin and was hit. The kingdoms of this earth, even mighty America, can be shaken. But the kingdom we are receiving cannot be shaken. It can never move. And that takes all the heat out of political debate, but that's another side point. And if you're not yet a Christian, you can receive this ultimate security. All you need to do is turn to Jesus tonight. Turn to him. Ask him to go ahead of you. Ask him to walk with you. Ask him to walk up that great mountain in front of you. And watch the unapproachable mountain of God's glory turn into something you can sprint up with delight and ease and joy, together with brothers and sisters. Earlier, I asked, how do we recover from self-inflicted spiritual injuries? Mercifully, we don't need one of these. We need each other. God's people, the church. We chase together. We see together. We celebrate the grace of God together. And we accept his word together. Hebrews has so much more to say on what moving forward with Jesus looks like in practice. But for now, we can say that our Sunday meetings matter. I recognize I'm probably preaching to the choir in this room. But these meetings genuinely matter. Because every time on a Sunday, that is exactly what we are doing. We are chasing peace with one another. We are chasing holiness together. We are seeing that none of us fall short as we focus on Jesus Christ. We're celebrating his finished work at the cross. And we accept his words together. King Jesus has given us a kingdom by his blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. And so let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire.